Hello, I'm Professor Margaret Ann Carter and I'm Chair of the Counselling discipline with the Australian College of Applied Professions. And I'm delighted to be welcoming you to our 2021 inaugural National Heads of Counselling and Psychotherapy Education webinar, Restoring Teaching and Learning Online. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where we live, where we learn and where we work, and their connection to land, to sea and community. I pay my respects to ancestors and elders, past and present and emerging, and extend this respect to all Indigenous people who are here on the platform with us today. The National Heads of Counselling and Psychotherapy Education, NHCPE for short, Steering Committee aspires to represent the voices of higher education, counsellor and psychotherapy educators in Australia. The members of the Steering Committee, Nathan Beale, Penny Gardner, Tony Neal, Paul Borges, Michael Davis and myself are thrilled that you'll be able to join us. We've got over 160 members, 160 of you in the audience. Today's webinar is presented in collaboration with and it's sponsored by the Australian College of Applied Professions. The initiative for today is in response to a significant number of counsellor and psychotherapy educators working in higher education that have come to the network and asked for professional development event on this exact topic, restoring teaching and learning online. As each one of us knows, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the way that we teach counselling and psychotherapy education. And some would say it's changed that landscape forever. With the sudden shift moving from on-campus to synchronous online, intensive workshops, residential schools online, it's a very different landscape for us. Our nationally renowned presenters are going to combine their lived experience of teaching, counselling and higher education, learning design with evidence-based approaches to build connectivity for our students and for our educators. Our speakers today are Resh Ramasamy, Marcus O'Donnell and Danny Liu. Each speaker has the platform for 20 minutes. Following on from these presentations, we'll have a 20 to 25 minute conversation that's going to be facilitated by Mike Davies from the Australian Institute of Professional Counsellors. Paul Borges, one of our steering committee members from Avondale University College, will be monitoring the chat room and Paul will engage with you through the webinar. I invite and encourage you, in fact, to engage in conversation in the chats throughout our three presentations today. It would be wonderful to have your contribution in a strength-based conversation of a community of learning as we listen, deliberate, ponder, and consider actions moving forward. It is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Resh Ramasamy. And Resh is a coloured autistic queer person. Resh is an academic in the counselling discipline here at the Australian College of Applied Professions. In his position, he is a national educator and he's a tutor in various counselling and multidisciplinary units within our undergraduate counselling course, teaching both blended and online. Resh has recently been awarded a prestigious title of Distinguished Honorary Professor by the Global Forum for Teacher Educations for his contribution in education, philanthropy and human rights. Resh will deliver a presentation on negotiating and navigating online teaching and learning spaces amidst the pandemic. As Resh has recorded his presentation, he'll be joining Paul in the chat room, along with our other speakers and hopefully yourselves in the audience as you engage and listen and ponder to Resh's points of attention. Thank you, Resh.
Warm greetings and namaste. My name is Resh Ramasamy. Welcome to my presentation titled Negotiating and Navigating Online Teaching and Learning Spaces Amid the Pandemic. I would like to assert a heartfelt thank you to the Australian College of Applied Professions and the National Heads of Counselling and Psychotherapy Education Network for affording me the privilege to share my narrative on my teaching journey and teaching experiences within a digital space. Before I begin my presentation, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. The use of information and communication technology has created a new teaching and learning concept in education known as Cybergolgi. The Cybergolgi for engaged learning model was coined by Wang and Kang in 2006, and it's created particularly for online settings that involve more generative and constructive learning activities and task immersion. It features 3 overlapping and intersecting domains, which encapsulates cognitive, emotive, and social factors. Wang and Kang argued that engaged learning within a digital space will only occur when the critical factors within each domains have been acknowledged and attended to. One of the central elements of Cybergolgi is that the intent to combine fundamentals of pedagogy, andragogy, and heterogogy to arrive at a new approach of teaching and learning within an online space. Now, most of what I'm about to share in this presentation originates from my teaching experience and expertise, and it might be common sense to most or all of you in this conference. But I'm hoping the presentation will add and benefit to your teaching practices within a digital space. Moreover, due to time constraints, I won't be able to share the framework or discuss the framework in its entirety. Therefore, I've picked out some elements within each factors for discussion and further illumination. Before I discuss those 3 factors, I will also provide examples when talking about those factors and how I, as an educator, deploy the various factors in my teaching practices. So let's talk about cognitive factors briefly. So the cognitive domain pertains to the factors that initiate and instigate an individual's construction of knowledge. It explores the way an individual optimizes personal relevance and meaning through the knowledge construction process. Let's look at prior knowledge or prior experiences. Merrill 2002 reported, learning is encouraged when existing knowledge or prior experience is acknowledged. Powerful. As we know, learning proceeds primarily from prior knowledge and secondarily from the presented materials and content. Neglect of prior knowledge can result in the learner showing no or a lack of interest in the education content, no matter how well those intentions or instructions are orchestrated by the educator within the lecture or a task. Many of our students at ACAP, they come from different walks of life and they bring such rich experience and expertise. Whilst as a researcher myself, whilst I appreciate research and scientific evidence, I'm equally interested in discerning how learners understand the world around them through their lived experiences, which is reflective of their existing bank of knowledge. I often share my lived experiences and life stories in the classes openly, which has helped students to share theirs. This I found useful for students to relate their personal experiences to their educational experiences, which makes it not just a mere task or a business transaction, but something more personable meaningful, and educative to them. In terms of the learning activities, task needs to be engaging, and this is especially crucial when you're engaging with learners in an online setting. Given I'm responsible for developing tutorials and tutorial activities for my classes as a national educator for 2 of my topics, I consciously include tasks and activities that help promote practical understandings and application. The tasks are also intended to dig deeper into a learner's tacit knowledge, which plays a huge influence over their explicit knowledge, which aids in that learning process. Students are not interested in bulky theories and notions. What they're wanting is how can they take what they have learned and apply it in their daily life and interactions. And this is especially relevant when engaging in an online class space to keep the content interesting and dynamic. I'm also in favor of gamification and game-based learning. For example, I incorporate Kahoot quizzes to keep the content interactive and engaging, and it's rooted within play-based learning modalities. The use of task analysis in the form of scaffolds I also found helpful in clarifying assessment instructions. Using a task analysis approach enables me to assess what the students are able to do, what are the steps involved in attempting and completing the assessments, what are the curriculum's objectives, and how, as an educator, can I support my students to achieve their learning goals and intended outcomes. And I found the task analysis especially useful in helping neurodiverse and disabled students in understanding the assessments as they require structure and predictability. One principle of pedagogy is double loop learning, which expands and extends into Cybergolgi. And double loop learning is an educational concept and process that involves teaching people or learners to think more deeply about their own assumptions and beliefs. It stresses the importance of developing students' meta-cognitive abilities, which includes things like self-reflection, self-evaluation, self-appraisal, and self-observation. For example, within my tutorial activities and classes, I welcome and embrace plentiful self-reflection, and I do encourage my students to think outside the square, to challenge archaic perceptions and ideologies, and to think out of their comfort zone. And this helps students and learners to consciously discern the implicit and explicit biases and assumptions, which helps them turn those difficult, those uncomfortable experiences and conversations into teachable moments for myself as an educator, but also for themselves as the learner. So it's a two-way reciprocal thing. It's a win-win situation for the educator and for the learner, of course. In terms of the social factors, when we think of personal attributes, we think of learner expectations. They must be accounted for. I often ask my students in my tutorials, what are their expectations from the unit and of me as an educator? And this is helpful in ensuring the expectations aligns with my teaching style and delivery and the content, of course. Let's be honest and face the truth. Students are consumers after all. I found they are increasingly demonstrating consumer-like behaviors and are now demanding even more value from institutions. There is a growing body of research that supports these assertions as well. The phrase, the student experience, has become particularly dominant and prevalent in higher education over the last decade. We must therefore find meaningful and personalized ways of meeting the needs of our students and learners. You can't obviously please all, but you can establish a common ground that is useful, and a consumer-focused mindset is also required in this regard. In terms of the social context, every learner possesses a background and a distinctive culture that the learner will undoubtedly bring to every learning endeavor or experience. I found referring to the theoretical tenets of intersectionality helpful in privileging learners' intersectional differences and how these differences shape and inform their learning experiences. In terms of the ecological systems theory by Bronfenbrenner, there are 5 different ecological environments: the micro, the meso, the exo, the macro, and the chronosystem levels. The micro environment, being the most influential environment of interaction, is crucial in determining if a student or a learner engages or disengages with the program or the content. And the micro interactions within a higher education setting usually pertains to interactions with academics, students, and professional staff. Therefore, as the national educator for 2 of my classes, I ensure the communication between staff and students are positive, timely, and enabling in nature. This helps with the development of a positive, evaluated sense of self-identity and social identity, which helps make students feel affirmed, important, and included. In terms of community and communication, as a narrative inquirer, I value the importance of storytelling. Okay, within the education context, narrative-based learning is grounded in the theory that humans define their experiences within the context of narratives. And whilst this is not conventional practice within academia, we need to understand people's stories. We need to understand when stories are shared in the right context, without the context being prostituted, and for an educative purpose. By sharing of stories, it creates an empowering and emancipatory effect. By sharing stories, it also helps us to re-author our lives by creating new and inspired meanings. I also engage routinely in co-teaching in the form of teaming, which is one of the most effective forms of co-teaching. And this involves educators working together on planning, organizational delivery, assessment instructions, and so forth. The teaming approach helps with delivering the same content to students from different classes, which aids with information equity. This is especially important to circumvent unnecessary anxiety and angst when navigating online learning spaces among students. In terms of the emotive factors, teaching and learning are often framed as largely rational and objective and cognitively determined. But there's more research that supports the need for emotions to be a part of the teaching process, as students often experience a myriad of emotions, from feeling excited to frustrated, which can lead to a range of different emotional responses. So in terms of feelings of community, engagement requires a sense of fitting in within the larger contours of society and within the higher education setting as well. The feelings of belonging contributes to students' motivation, involvement, and satisfaction, with their learning process. I often use the word in my classes, family unit, when interacting with my students. It has never been about me or them, but us as a collective. What's important is how do we as educators actively work in cultivating an in-group identity amongst our students and teachers through a person-centered manner. One initiative that I've deployed in my classes is called the Staff and Student Voice Initiatives. Students and staff share about their inspirational stories and how these stories are influential in helping other staff and other students to feel a sense of community. And feelings of learning atmosphere. Quality interaction among students and educators are conducive to a positive learning atmosphere, and one that is marked by socializations, rapport, connections, empathy, debates, consultations, and open negotiations. We need to remember this. We are not working with children, but we are working with adults. Respect should be at the center of what we do as educators. I always consciously and consistently make the effort to humanize what I do with my students and my staff in my interactions and my communications. Before we go around telling students how to behave, we as educators must have good self-awareness and lead by example by default. That concludes my presentation for today. Thank you for devoting your time and energy to attend this talk. I hope you've learned something from this presentation, and I look forward to answering any questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Resh, for a really thoughtful, insightful, and definitely a evidence-informed practical presentation. So I think you've given us a lot there to ponder on and to consider in terms of our own practice and our own lived experience. I look forward to continuing this conversation with you, with our panel later in the webinar.
Thank you, Margaret.
It's now my pleasure to build on what Resh has been talking about as he set the scene for us. And I'm really delighted to welcome our second speaker to the webinar, Marcus O'Donnell. Marcus is a professor of higher education at Navitas, and he concentrates within this role in terms of teaching and learning initiatives in a range of projects across disciplines, including counselling, social work, psychology, and coaching. Prior to joining Navitas, Marcus held various senior leadership positions at Deakin University, including the Pro-Vice Chancellor, Teaching and Learning, and Director of Digital Learning. Marcus is going to talk with us about learning design within the online landscape. One of the things that we learned from moving to the emergency remote teaching is that we can't simply move online without moving the way we actually design pathways for learning, pathways for student and peer interaction, and pathways for dialogical feedback. So please join me in welcoming Marcus as our second presenter for today's webinar. I'm not hearing you at the moment, Marcus. I don't know if others can.
I think you're muted.
That's because I've made a classic rookie mistake and I didn't unmute.
And I know that was planned.
Yes. absolutely. Thanks, Margaret, and thanks, Resh. That was a great opening presentation, and I think that probably Danny and myself will build on that framework that you've provided. Certainly, I'm very interested in ecological approaches that bring together those very different ways that we connect with one another and our very different learning environments. As Margaret said, I'm going to talk a little bit about design. I want to talk about the difference between this notion of, oh, we're going to move online, as if we can just kind of pick stuff up and put it somewhere, and start to explore that notion that we're going to move online suggests a couple of things. It suggests that we're in one place over here and then we move places. So I want to explore a little bit about the notion of place and what it means for an online or a digital learning experience. And as Margaret said, I want to explore explicitly how does design as an idea, as a discipline, help us in thinking about the challenges of online learning. We all know there's been studies over decades now that tell us quite clearly that learning outcomes for a face-to-face experience on campus and learning outcomes for a well-designed online experience, that if both environments are taught well, there are no differences for the learning outcomes. We can achieve very good learning outcomes in both environments. And I know within the counselling profession, particularly in the United States, there's a decade of history in terms of counselling courses being delivered online. And again, we've seen from a number of studies that even complex things like skills training can be delivered very well online. And again, there have been a number of studies that compare skills training in counselling online and in person, and no significant differences. But what does it mean for us to really create a dynamic online experience for our students? And the title of our talk today is about restorying. How do we start to think again about what it means to be in an online space with our students? So I'm going to talk about place, I'm going to talk about design, and then I'm going to show you some examples from a team that I used to lead at Deakin University that specialises in designing online places for learning. So if I use the term digital place, what things come to mind for people? I'm going to ask you to just pop into the chat and to type 3 words that come to mind when I say the phrase digital place. What does that mean for you? Just three words: online, remote, distant, exposure, learning management system, on a computer, secured space, convenience. So there we can see immediately a number of different things emerging. Virtual, it's on a computer, it might be convenient, Social media, so there's a social dimension. Technology, so for a lot of people are thinking in terms of how we do it. It's through technology. But there we are, we've got somebody who's written it's intimate. Somebody else said it was distant. So we can have very different ideas of what an online place is. And the last comment there, different ways of connecting with others. So we bring in this notion of connection. Untailored, unnuanced, easy to be missed. That's an interesting one. Anywhere. So it's dispersed. It's place, which we usually think of as anchored, but it's dispersed. So it's a very kind of contradictory notion of place, perhaps. Okay, so let's try and unpack what it might mean to think about a digital place. My academic background is as a journalism educator and a media studies educator. And thinking about digital places is very similar to thinking about media. And we can think about media as a physical object, a newspaper, which of course isn't what most media is anymore. Or we can think of them as Siegfried Zelensky, a media anthropologist, thinks about them. He talks about media as spaces for action. So that immediately turns a traditional notion of media on its head. Media isn't something that we consume, it's a place of action where we construct connection and we attempt to connect what is separated. And I think we can think about digital learning in a very similar way. So just to kind of take that phrase and adapt it a little, I think we can think about digital learning or digital places as digital learning creates spaces of action for constructed attempts to connect what is separated. And that again reaches back to what Resh was talking about, the active learning environment that we need to create in our classrooms. This is a typical picture of a 60s or a 70s kitchen. And whenever I think of a sense of place, I always find myself back in my childhood house in Broadmeadows in Melbourne, in my mother's kitchen. That's my memory of the safe place of my childhood. The kitchen was where it all happened in our house. I came home and I sat there at a bench just like this one and watched my mother cook or watched her iron or talked about the day. So the kitchen was where we ate, where we gathered, where we ran to when the telephone rang. And that physical place from my childhood has now become a virtual memory. And place is like that. Place is not just physically located, it always moves between the virtual and the physical, the imagined and the real. So it's not a stretch when we think about that to start to really think about vivid engagement with virtual spaces in the same way that I have a very vivid engagement with that memory of a physical space. And that space that I was describing, that childhood space, it's about that physical environment, the kitchen, leaning against the bench, the light that used to come in the big window. It's the physical space, but it's also my relationship with my mother. So spaces are created by relationships. They're not just about the physicality. And we might say that it's really the coming together of the physical and the relational that actually kind of makes a space a place, if you like. And so I think we have to think about the digital environment in the same way. It's how do we bring together the physical environment of the computer or the technology we're using with the relationships to change that virtual space into a place. It's also a political space. That space that I'm describing of my childhood. My mother lived a very traditional gendered life as a 1970s housewife, and my relationship to her was along those lines. But she used that kitchen as a space to create her identity within the confines of that framework. And so there's always a power dimension, there's always a political dimension to the way we create space. So we might say that the virtual space is about the physical environment of the technology, it's about the relationship, and it's about the politics and power that happen in that space. And it's some theorists of online education have started to rethink this notion of place for online education. And there's a group from Edinburgh University led by Sian Bain who've recently published this manifesto for teaching online. And it's a series of propositions. And this is work they've been working on for over a decade. It's been revised since 2011. And it's recently been published as a book. And the first proposition that they enunciate is that online can be a privileged mode. We shouldn't think about online as second best. We shouldn't think about online as replicating something that happens in the classroom. Distance can be positive. There are all sorts of advantages of distance education, convenience and flexibility being one of the most obvious. And we need to stop thinking of the digital learning experience as from a deficit place. And we need to think about place differently but not less important online. So our online environments, as Resh was pointing out, involved emotions, for example. They involve physically sitting somewhere. They involve physical environments. So I'm experiencing my computer screen as a physical environment. I'm also sitting in a room. I'm also have posture on a chair. I have earphones. I'm interacting in physical ways in a digital space. And so I think part of the restorying of digital learning, restorying of online education, is to start to think again about place and how we conceptualize the place that we create when we create online education. And one of the ways that we create place, because place is created, it isn't just static, is we create that through design work. And so the next thing I really want to talk about is digital design. And I'm going to ask you again to jump on the chat and put in a couple of words that come to mind when I say the word design. What does design mean to you? I love that comment there, I dance in lectures. How do we dance online? Creation, showcase, engage, imagination, create. Yep, different ways of thinking, innovation, structure. So innovation and structure, isn't that interesting? So we're getting contrasts again. We're getting spectrums of experience when we think about these different elements. Something visually appealing. Joy, clear navigation. Engagement. Process, images, ideas. So there's a lot of different notions, in the same way that we had a lot of different notions of place, and that some of those things were kind of almost colliding or stretching one another. Some of these notions of design are also colliding or stretching one another. Art, purpose, intent, communication. Okay, so let's unpack some of that a little. Design's actually something, it's fundamentally human. It's something we do every day. So we might say that, you know, we're going to have a dinner party. We think of designing a menu. If it's a very big occasion, we put a lot more effort into how we design that occasion. We start thinking about the place that it's going to be in, the people that are coming. We design the menu, we design the invite list, we design the space. If it's just family or intimate friends, we might kind of wing it. And that notion of winging it is a really interesting one in terms of design. It's sort of, it's saying that we've designed these types of experiences so many times that we can kind of do a certain amount of it instinctively. And that's what designers call design thinking. And many of you will know this notion of design thinking. It arises out of a body of research that looked at architects and artists and industrial designers and said, okay, what is the process that these people go through to come up with the things that they come up with? And four of the elements that have been kind of systematized into this notion of design thinking is that it's experimental, it's iterative. It works through trying out things and doing again and getting better. It's a physical practice. So designers make prototypes, they do drawings, they test things out physically. And I think that's a really interesting one for us as teachers, and particularly in thinking of the design of online experiences, this notion of testing things out and physically mocking things up. And it involves emotion. It involves us placing ourselves in the experience of the user. So it involves empathy. So if I'm an industrial designer and I'm designing this glass, I'm thinking about the edges, I'm thinking about how I hold it, I'm thinking about what happens when there's cold liquid in here and what happens when there's hot liquid in here. I'm thinking about the kind of smooth rim when I put it to my lips. I'm thinking through the whole process, and I'm putting myself in the space of the user. So this notion of empathy and entering into the space of our students is, I think, a really important one. And one of the other things that designers do, they reframe problems. They think, how can we think about this in a completely different way? How can we think about this from scratch? So they're three elements that we can bring to our thinking about digital learning. What am I doing? I'm going to skip a couple of slides because I want to go straight to some of the examples that the team that I worked with at Deakin University, we did a big project called Cloud First. We asked ourselves, how can we think about designing a unit from the point of view of online first? So we design it for online students first, and then we use those online artifacts and those online resources and those online places that we create and see how it can be used in the classroom for located experience. So we were doing the reverse of what usually happens in design. And the model that we came up with, there were 5 core things. For online learners, learning has to be supported in a very particular way. So we can't rely necessarily on casual conversations that occur in a located experience. So things have to be explicit and support has to be explicit. It has to be activity focused. We have to ask students to do things. We have to note that it's social, and it's social between teacher and student, students and students. Feedback focused. How do we give feedback to students? And it has to be scaffolded, which comes back to that notion of how do we build the narrative in such a way that everything is explicitly there and that we don't rely on the kind of things that might happen peripherally in a classroom, because we have to make the learning narrative very, very clear. And I'm just going to show you some examples before I finish up. This is these are just screenshots from the learning sites to give you a bit of idea of what happened. So this is from a law unit, and as you can see up the top, it's based on case studies, and it's based on action and very clear teacher presence with video. So we create this notion of the teacher as guide. It's a social encounter with the presence of the educator who creates the narrative. These sections repeat each week. So we repeat things in an online environment so as students know what to expect. This is another example from an MBA where we created 3 very different types of learning. In essence, that was the key knowledge area. In focus, we applied that to current events in the news, and in context, we got students to apply that to their area of interest in an assignment. So we structured the learning in particular ways, and again, we repeated that week by week. Visual design can be very important. This is an example of all things, an advanced math unit, which was constructed as a game. And you can see that there is a map through Egypt, China, Mesopotamia, because we can trace math and innovations in math through a map of history and through a map of different environments. So we created a quest narrative. We used a lot of visuals. We created personas for people to apply this. This is another example from education. Again, from an MBA unit, setting out in advance the journey of the unit. This sets out a map of the journey of the unit. Where will we take them so that students know where they're going? In an education research unit, it was presented as a comic. So again, using lots of different media and lots of different forms. So I'm going to stop there, and we can come back to some of these issues and examples in the discussion.
Thank you, Marcus, for a really interactive and thought-provoking and instructive presentation. I really appreciated how you got us thinking in terms of so many concepts, that even the definition of the digital learning and that connection between space and place and the key role that relationships hold. I think that as you were talking also in terms of the physical environment in the virtual world, the challenge that we have in terms of the politics and the power within that space. And I think there's some of the challenges as counsellor and educators that we struggle with ourselves on a daily basis. I loved the manifesto of teaching online, and the fact also it hit me that this has been 10 years and it's been revisioned. So we're not new into this territory, and I think we need to respect that and not think we're starting as newbies as we engage in this territory. Your invitation to us was beautiful synergy with what Resh talked about in terms of the digital design, and then getting us thinking about digital thinking, the digital pathways. And I loved your challenge to us as putting ourselves in the space of the user, the student, taking us on that journey of the cloud-first learning design, a beautiful synergy once again with what Resh talked us through, and those remarkable examples of what's possible. So I'm delighted that you're here at Navitas, and I look forward to us walking with you to be enlightened and to be empowered of a different way of being in relationship in that space, so that we can restore teaching and learning in the online space. So thank you, Marcus, very much. And I look forward to our conversation at the end of our webinar today. It's now my great honour to introduce our third speaker, Danny Liu. And Danny is an educator, he's an academic developer, and he's a researcher. He's currently an associate professor in the DVC education portfolio at the University of Sydney. And in this particular position, he leads academics and staff across the institution in educational innovation, blended and online teaching, and the effective use of analytics to improve student learning and experience. Today, in Danny's presentation, Danny has been tasked with attempting to be the glue between Resh's presentation that started off the lived experience and then the models that we've just been on a journey with Marcus in terms of effective teaching and learning design. To do this, Danny will bring in tried and tested and evidence-based informed approaches for teaching that can help bridge the boundaries and the connectivity within the online face-to-face and blended learning. So please join with me in welcoming Danny to the platform.
Thanks so much, Margaret. That was a lovely introduction. As I get my keyboard and mouse sorted, I wonder if we could open up Zoom chat again and just see if we can answer that question on the screen. I'm just going to try and copy what Marcus did and get some audience interaction going here. As we get our numbers typed into Zoom chat, I'd like to acknowledge the Darug people whose land I'm on today, and pay respect to the elders past, present and emerging. And also really thank the NHCPE for the opportunity today to speak to you. My family has a history of, I guess, stigma towards seeking counselling help, and I myself had that stigma up until last year, where I finally put up the courage to actually speak to a counsellor, and that changed my life. And so I want to say that what you're all doing in terms of counselling is really life changing. And so hopefully I can help a little bit with thinking through some educational perspectives, but in no way am I pretending to be a counselling educator like this. But yeah, thank you for those who have typed in their numbers on the screen. So there's, mostly above 5s, which is quite encouraging. This morning I was probably a 2, and I've got a pretty difficult conversation coming up after this, so I'm probably going to be a 2 at about 5 o'clock, but now I'm probably feeling about a 6. Yes, that's nice. Thank you for sharing how you're feeling on today. And it's good that we're all feeling kind of about a 6.7. That's the very unscientific average I've taken from that. Okay, so Margaret asked me to kind of think back and think about, are we doing online teaching right? And we've heard from Marcus and Resh that online teaching can work. And I wanted to kind of really briefly look at some of the research behind this in the last 10, 15 years. One of them is this pre-COVID study of medical education. And what these people found is that they looked at a bunch of studies in the meta-analysis, and they found essentially, like Marcus was saying, no significant difference. Online working worked just as well as face-to-face learning. And so this was published in 2019. They looked at literature from, I think, about 2000 onwards. This was a randomized controlled trial performed at West Point Military Academy, where it's probably ethical to do something like this. It was on a microeconomics course, which had to pivot really quickly, like we all did, online during COVID. And what they found is that online instruction actually reduced a student's final grade. And so you can see in the graph that the dotted line is kind of towards the left, which suggests that the online learning is not as good as the face-to-face. What they said was being in the online class reduced the connection. We've heard connection a lot today, reduced the feeling that the instructor cared about them and also how connected they felt towards their peers. And so what we're starting to see here is maybe, there's a design element here. And Marcus talked a lot about design. And I think what is probably coming across in this randomized controlled trial is that there probably wasn't a lot of design in this pivot. And so design is really important. The other thing that's coming across here is really the importance of teacher relationships and also peer relationships. We've heard about connection a lot in Resh and also Marcus's presentations. And I think this is drawn out through the literature as well. This study was done with dentistry students. It was comparing kind of learning pre-COVID and also in COVID. And what they found is that, or actually this is the flip side now compared to the West Point study, that online study actually leads to a higher likelihood of getting an A grade compared to face-to-face study. Okay? And also they cited things like enhanced flexibility as one of the main drivers for online, but they also said that students felt a bit safer to contribute, but they also recognized that there was that lack of connection there. Okay, so the ideas behind flexibility was there, which is a positive. The idea behind safety online, which is also a positive, and also the idea between those relationships as well. And so what these studies really tell us is that it's a bit confusing. Online teaching isn't worse, it's not better. And I think, like Marcus said, it's kind of the same, because good teaching is good teaching. If you're able to do good teaching online and do good teaching offline, it is just good teaching. And so the question is, what is good teaching? Active learning has been something that both Marcus and Resh have been talking about. And so it's been really good to see some research around this over the past 5 to 10 years. This was a really large meta-analysis out about 7 years ago by Freeman et al. In PNAS. And what they found after looking at thousands of studies across hundreds of thousands of students is that active learning was associated with increased assessment scores and also decreased failure rates. Active learning, the idea behind that being that students aren't passively receiving, so they're not doing what you're doing right now, which is listening to me, but they're actually actively challenging, actively inquiring, actively answering, actively processing information. And these people found that active learning is really the preferred, empirically validated and supported way of teaching in classrooms that actually leads to better student outcomes. The problem, though, with active learning is that this other study, which is quite interesting, and I've started at the bottom because it's quite an interesting read. This study found that active learners, they learned more, just like the previous study said, but they didn't like it. They enjoyed it much less because they had to use their brains. So you see that the graph on this left side here says, I enjoyed this lecture less for active learning. I felt like I learned less. The instructor was effective less. And also, I wish my courses were done this way less, but they actually learned more. And so I think what this tells us is that this negative correlation is actually due to this increased effort that comes through active learning. And so the cognitive effort is something else I want to pull apart here as well. Finally, around active learning, there's this other thing about active learning being more inclusive. This is a study just a year ago, and they found that minoritized student groups tend to have lower assessment and achievement scores. Okay, there's a gap between performance, and the gap is illustrated by this distance here in this particular graph. And they found that this gap, when they used active learning, this gap actually reduced for minoritized groups. And so the authors said that widespread use of active learning is actually an equity issue. Okay, if we want to teach equitably, we need to use active learning because it actually helps to reduce this achievement gap. And why is this the case? Why does active learning promote equity? This other paper out just this year, actually in Science, talked about the structure of the experience and also the opportunities for deliberate practice. They spoke about design, essentially, and they spoke about cognitive effort being the reasons why active learning is a more equitable way of teaching. They also said that minoritized students, they gain disproportionate benefits compared to other students in terms of belonging and inclusion. And the reason behind this is that they actually felt a stronger relationship and connection between teachers and also each other when active learning was used. So this is really interesting to think about active learning as something which is actually promoting learning. This other paper, which is out this year, which was actually quite useful as well, and I really recommend a read of this, is about trauma-informed pedagogy. We've all our students, all of us, all of our families, all around us, we've all experienced significant trauma over the past 2 years. And so this trauma-informed pedagogy approach that this paper talks about speaks of, I think, 9 different factors. I'll highlight 4 on the screen for you. One of them was around safety. This is about providing students with structure, communication, strong expectations, and validating their experiences. The second one was trustworthiness and transparency. It was about how, as teachers, we need to be prepared and responsive and open to students so that they can build this trust with us. One of the other ones was around collaboration and mutuality. This was around helping students to see that they could also speak into their own learning. And the other one, one of the other ones are around empowerment, voice, and choice. And so this is really about kind of affirming students. And all of these, Resh and Marcus both spoke about. And so we see ideas around design and safety come in place. We see ideas around teacher relationships, around peer relationships coming through this as well. Okay. And finally, with relationships, this is a really nice book that was out right before the pandemic. And this book talks about how the classroom is the most important place on campus, either the physical or the online campus, where these meaningful relationships actually take root. And that learning at its heart is a relational process. I love this quote. And this really emphasizes that teaching is about relation, about relating to your students and the content and those kind of things. So with this in mind, we had Resh speak to us earlier, and Resh highlighted this lovely Cybergolgi model, and he spoke about cognitive effort, getting his students to actually think and apply knowledge in class. He talked about building this idea of trust and safety in his classrooms, and also building that relationship between students and himself and each other. Marcus spoke about digital learning, and he spoke about that really important idea of creating. Okay, so we all spoke about innovation, creation, design, and that idea of connecting through design, what is separated, really brings together the ideas of relationships. And so, I guess trying to land this massive plane, where do we go from here? Change one thing. There are kind of these boxes that I've been putting up during the session today, and the 2 of the green ones talk to intentional design for student activity. So trying to design learning experiences so that students can actually apply some cognitive effort, and that really helps their learning. We've also spoken about the affordances of online, increasing safety for students and also increasing flexibility. And also this really important idea, I guess, of relationships and connections. So how do we apply this? For larger online classes, I'm going to take a few examples from what I've seen around Sydney University and also my own work. Chunking is a really big thing. So what I mean by chunking is that usually we do this. Okay, we have 60 minutes of talking as students, didactic teaching. And so what we've seen quite effectively used is something like this. You split it up, you chunk it so that you ask students a question perhaps, do some teaching, ask them some more questions, do some more teaching, and then so on and so forth. And what this does is it encourages active learning. It encourages students to actually use their heads and apply this cognitive effort. They may not like it as much, but it's actually better for them. Anonymous response systems. Okay, so Zoom chat is not so anonymous, but you can rename yourself on Zoom chat, and so you can be Winnie the Pooh and type 7 out of 10 or something. But you have other things online. Resh mentioned Kahoot that he uses, which is quite a nice platform as well. Platforms which you can use to do anonymous response systems. And the point of these response systems is to get student input into your own class. And so that's the little screenshot down the bottom of one of the textual analysis that I do in one of my classes. And you can see all those stamps, the question marks and the hearts and the arrows and those kind of things. Those are just students annotating on my screen using the Zoom annotation function. And that's their way of anonymously contributing to discussion in my classes. And that anonymous discussion really helps to increase the safety that they feel. Okay. If you're interested in finding out more about this, Google Teaching at Sydney space chunking, and you'll find out more about what we do here. Smaller groups. Smaller groups are sometimes easier, sometimes harder to manage online. Scripts are useful, and also having students produce a shared online artifact quite useful. I'll show you an example of both of these. This is an example of a Google Doc that sits online, and as part of this Google Doc, what we do is we provide students a script, a social script, an epistemic script, and also a procedural script. And what this means is it tells them how to operate within small online breakouts, for example. So step 1, open this thing. Step 2, share a screen. Step 3, fill something in. Okay. And then you provide them a space, this shared online space, for example, a Padlet, a Jamboard, a Google Doc, where they can actually input stuff together. And so the intentional design of this really helps to draw out student conversation and also to build peer-to-peer relationships. And again, if you're interested in finding out more about this, Google Teaching at Sydney, Feel the Room. And we've got some articles on this as well. So that's large classes online and also small classes online, and intentional design to make them work for active learning. Other things you can do asynchronously online. So this is a pre-recorded content, for example. We saw in Marcus's examples of that idea of presenting yourself as a human being in a video really helps the students build those relationships with you. Consistent structure, again, we saw that through Marcus's presentation as well, with a lovely cloud-first structure that he showed. And also multiple means of engagement through recording, slide decks, captions, providing this flexibility for students. If you're interested in finding out this, again, Google Teaching at Sydney, don't get lost. And we've got a few articles on this as well. One of the really important things, one of my colleagues, Alex, she works in the same department as I do. And she recently posted this tweet, and it was quite useful because she talked about something that we often don't do or forget to do, or at least I forget to do, is that we forget to tell our students why we're doing certain things or why we're teaching them. And so she wrote this tweet, which 322 likes, that's viral in my books. And so she talked about it's really important to include students in this design. It builds relationships with you because they understand what you're doing, and also it shows intentional design back to the student, which is really important. And finally, it's really important to meet your students where they are. And I think build these relationships with them and ask them how their safety will be fostered. And so the thing I did at the beginning, getting you to type in that number from 1 to 10, that hopefully was something that helped you to express a little bit of yourself and help build a bit of that in-group identity that Resh was talking about as well. Okay. And the ideas behind this, again, a bit of building safety and also building that relationship between the students and each other, and also the teacher and the student. So with that really rushed run through online learning, if you want to find out more about this, Teaching at Sydney Wellbeing, Google it, and you'll find some articles there. But with that, I think we're going to move on to a panel, and thank you for your time today.
Danny, just before we do move to the panel, I really wanted to thank you for your insightful and enlightening presentation. And I loved your giftedness of how you were able to bridge between the presentations of Resh and of Marcus, and the words that came through very strongly in terms of the relationship, the connectivity, that flexibility and safety, and a number of things that you identified. If we go back to earlier on when the audience was asked the questions by Marcus, what do you think about? And they were able to name, and then we had, you know, sometimes two ends of the continuum. And it was fabulous how you're able to apply. So building on and building upon of what our previous presenters talked about, your deep dive into that trauma-informed pedagogy. I know that there'd be a large number of the audience on the platform that will be very interested in exploring that. And once again, that concept of safety, empowerment, voice, agency, collaboration, trustworthiness and transparency. Absolutely critical in terms of why we do what we do and how we do it. So the intentionality that you talked about, similar to what Marcus and Resh were talking about, and then taking us through, and the generosity in terms of the chunking. And I know that a number of us, in terms of the way we teach, we're looking at different ways, one step better. And so the examples in terms of the larger online classes, the smaller online, being in that asynchronous environment. And finally, I think, as you had said so beautifully, and I think it captures what Marcus and Resh have also said, it's explaining why. It's making sure we've got the buy-in and that we honour our students in terms of in relationships, that mutuality. Thank you for referring us to Sydney, teaching at Sydney. Fill the room, don't get lost, and the chunking. So I'm sure there'll be lots of activity there. So I appreciate you connecting together our webinar. So thank you very much. Now I'd like us to move into a different space, and I'd like to ask Michael Davies, and Michael is going to take chair the conversation among yourselves in terms of feedback from the audience and some different things to just bring you all together to be able to respond to questions from our audience, and what you see is very important. So I'm going to hand the platform over to Mike.
Thanks, Margaret. Thank you very much, Marcus, Resh and Danny. As Margaret was saying, very good presentations that really connected with one another. And I think Danny did a great job of really uniting the whole thing. And I guess you went too fast for me though. That's what I was finding. There's some really great information there, and I was scribbling down notes and I just couldn't keep up. So I guess the first thing is that maybe there are some issues for people out there that they want to ask something a little bit more, either from yourself or from Resh or from Marcus, about things that were mentioned that they didn't quite get and that maybe needs a little bit more exploration. We do have a Q&A open, as you might find at the bottom of your screen. There's a Q&A section. There's no open questions have been asked so far. Everyone's jumping in on the chat, and I've got Paul monitoring that to see if any questions come through on the chat that we might be able to pose as a question. We've got one question through from Andrew. So can everyone see that? So Danny, I was wondering if you have any suggestions for good connections with students online. I'm constantly faced with the situation of asking my students how they're doing, genuinely, I think, and I'm met with silence or awkward thumbs up. Danny?
It's a really good question. And I think two things, specificity and anonymity. Anonymity online is quite important. And so if we're asking things like this, what I often do is I get students to either use a non-Zoom platform like Mentimeter or Kahoot, where they don't have to name themselves. If they're on Zoom, I ask them to rename themselves on Zoom so they could be Mickey Mouse and respond that way. So anonymity is important to get students to share. And also specificity. Specificity in terms of asking the question, I typically try to ask a specific question. So like the 1 to 10 thing, or what is the most boring thing that's happened to you this week? Or name 2 things you're looking forward to at 5 p.m. or something like that. So if you're more specific about the question, and also you give students anonymous safety, they hopefully will help them respond.
Annie, I'm wondering whether I can just ask you this. In where we have smaller classes, one of the things we often value in counsellor education is inviting people to make themselves vulnerable. And my experience has been that that works reasonably well in a classroom setting. I have found that harder to do over Zoom, and yet we as counselling educators see that as such a vital part of training to be a counsellor. We call it developing the person of the counsellor. My concern would be if I allow my students to hide by turning off their camera and by becoming Mickey Mouse, that in some way I'm actually defeating one of the very core elements of counsellor education. I just wonder whether you and perhaps the other 2 members might want to comment on that.
It's a really good point, and I think the anonymity is important in larger classes, but you're perfectly right. In smaller classes, I would recommend not being anonymous and having that vulnerability. So in smaller breakouts.
Okay, no more questions have come through on the Q&A at this stage, but Kate's written a fairly large question there in the chat that you might be able to see. So she's looking at issues about accessibility to digital space. So if you can read that, if any of the panel might like to respond to Kate. Danny, you're nodding a lot. Does that mean you've got a response?
I was waiting for Marcus or Resh to speak.
Yeah, they're a bit quiet back there, aren't they?
I think there are that's an incredibly important aspect as we mature in digital spaces, and there are a lot of different tools out there now that actually can help us ensure that there are auditing tools that will actually tell you if things on your LMS are accessible. So that's a very important part of the design. But in the same way that Danny said, good teaching is good teaching, which I absolutely agree with. Good design is good design, and it's usually accessible. If we're explaining things and making things explicit, that's usually good for a whole range of different cohorts. We do have to be careful, of course, in terms of bandwidth, and there still are digital access issues, and we can't pretend there aren't. So we have to, again, provide things in different formats and make sure that students can access them in different ways.
Yeah, if I can just quickly comment too that I come from a special ed background, and accommodations adjustments, there are about over 60 different adjustments that can be made in terms of design for learning, and UDL, Universal Design for Learning. People should just Google that and have a look at all the amount of material for the last 30 years has been developed in terms of designing learning so that everyone can access. So just a couple of points. Any other questions coming through, or any other responses? Resh, Marcus and Danny have had a chance to say something more since their presentations. Would you like to add anything in terms of things that you've seen?
Yes, I suppose just to add on to Mark's and Danny's comment as well, as an autistic lecturer, I do see some flaws in design as well. And I think in terms of like sensory sensitivities, like lighting and cameras and even information structures and how information is actually being, I suppose, in terms of, like, I suppose, formatting, writing, and all those sorts of things. So I do some things differently with some of my students who've got, I suppose, have got some special needs. And and I think being cognizant about those sorts of things, and by engaging with by engaging with students and having those, I suppose, conversations that are very important as well. Because, because sometimes, like I suppose, like a lecture or an assessment might not, I suppose, cater for all the needs of the students as well. So thinking outside the square can be quite helpful in this regard, and also seeking that feedback as well and consultation from students. And that's something that's helped me as well, just almost sort of see things from different perspectives as well. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Resh.
I do have one question for Marcus, though. I was very keen about this whole space concept. So Marcus, you talked to us about space and place. Could you please tell me a bit more about how can we intentionally, I suppose, create that safe space for students to feel more empowered in this online forum?
Yeah, great question, Resh. So I think there are a number of different aspects. Safety is one of them, and I mean, in many ways, like the example that Danny was using before, that on Zoom you can be Mickey Mouse, as well as Marcus or Resh. And so in a sense, there are things that we can do online that we can't do in class, that sometimes actually creates safer spaces for engagement. And it was very interesting at Deakin during the move to online teaching at the beginning of COVID, that I had a conversation with one of our medical lecturers, and she said, since we've moved our lectures online, we're getting lots more engagement in the chat than we ever got in the lecture room, because students were just more willing to jump in and talk more in the chat than they are in terms of embarrassingly putting up their hand in a big class. So I think there are some, advantages, and often online actually kind of automatically creates more possibilities for engagement and safety. I think the question that Paul brought up before about creating spaces for vulnerability is a really critical one, and that is something we have to kind of work hard in an online space, and more consciously, and like Danny said, providing scripts and providing specific exercises often works. But I also think it's practice and students becoming comfortable in the online space in the same way that you can't do that in a physical space in the first week of semester. So it's about providing models, providing opportunity, and being there also to follow up if things go wrong.
Yes, thanks for that, Marcus.
There's a couple more questions. Can I jump into those, Resh?
Awesome.
So if I can, what would be the most important thing for educators to do to re-engage students who have disengaged from online learning? So really important question for the panel.
I think I would actually say it starts with building that trust and mutuality, isn't it? Like, I think in a foreign landscape, things can be quite difficult and arduous. And I suppose if I was to reflect for my own self, when I had to transition from face-to-face classes to online classes with my autism, it was very difficult for me. I'll be very honest. It was hard work for me to sort of like, I suppose, take into account all the different things, and even though I suppose I had all the skills to teach in the online space, but I found some technology quite, I would say, caused me more anxiety. In fact, it was quite a paralyzing experience. So I think for me as an educator, it would be trying to understand the student from their vantage point, build that empathy and trust. I think it starts and ends with trust, you know?
Yep.
And I think by having that trust, or by inculcating trust in students, that in itself can build more confidence, you know, in terms of how they navigate the online space.
Thanks, Resh. We're running out of time. I'm just wondering whether we might answer the question that Bella's put forward. What are your thoughts on the relationship between students being consumers and students not being active learning, or active learners, I guess, or not liking active learning?
So do you mind if I share my screen to answer this one?
Yeah, go for it.
So this is an activity that we often show our lecturers when we're teaching them how to teach, so to speak. We give them this thing on the screen. We say, write these 8 words down. The words on the right, you have to make up yourself, and the words on the left, just copy what I've got, okay? And then we show them this activity. They do it for about 2 minutes on a piece of paper, and then we talk about some other stuff, and then we say, write down those 8 words again. Okay, and I guarantee you that when you try this at home later, you will write down more words in the right column compared to the left column, because you're doing active learning, you're using your brain for the right column. And so what we encourage lecturers to do is we encourage them to do this with their students. And then, because our role as an educator is really to help student learning, not to make it easy, but to help their learning. And if you do something like this kind of psychological experiment on them, hopefully they'll see that it actually works.
Yeah, I think that's terrific, and I think also that kind of metacognitive explanation that you were talking about before is also incredibly important, because it's like, why should I do this? How does this connect to what I'm going to be doing? A colleague of mine in journalism used to record students who had gone into the workplace saying things like, when I was learning particular things in Sean's class, I'm now using that in my workplace, and this is how I'm putting it into practice. So actually kind of making those explicit connections. Why should I learn this now? What is it going to do for me in the future is one thing. And then what you've just said, why am I doing this now? How's it going to help me learn? So it's like those two different motivations. How's it going to help me learn? How's it going to help me be a better professional or a better human being?
Okay, we do have another question that's come through from Janaki, but it's very much specific to helping private practicing counsellors. And I think there are both initiatives that ACAP, and also I know that our own organisation, AIPC, also have a program for helping private practitioners get up to speed with their own businesses. So maybe that's something that Janaki, you might want to contact both organisations. It sort of moves a little bit away from, I think, what we're talking about today. Margaret, I'm conscious that it's after 3:30, and I'm mindful that many people might have just scheduled the 1.5 hours in, and we don't seem to be having any other questions coming through, so perhaps I might leave it to you to close off.
Thanks, Mike. And thank you to Resh and to Marcus and to Danny for your generosity of spirit and your willingness to be the front runners and the leaders for our inaugural webinar. Thank you to Michael and to Paul and the fellow NHCPE Steering Committee colleagues. My gratitude to ACAP and particularly to William Spheres, who's worked behind the scenes to ensure today has gone as smoothly as possible. And I think to have such wonderful presenters, such quality presenters on something that's so important, we're very blessed indeed. We'll be emailing the link of this webinar out to everybody who's registered. We'll also be emailing attendance certificates out. If you just look into the chat room, Paul will just put up once more the website for the NHCPE, and if you'd like to learn a little bit more about it and your institution would like to become a member, please go and have a look at the institutional membership section on the site. So I'm going to thank everybody for joining today. Thank you for everybody who supported us by being present. We wish you a spectacular afternoon and a joyous Christmas season, and look forward to perhaps continuing this conversation in a sequel in 2022. So thank you to everybody.